All right, hello, and thanks for stopping by. I just want to go over a few things, probably about 15 or 20 things that I was thinking about that you would probably want to consider because I know a lot of people are talking about it. You're going to definitely want to know these things. There's a good few of them that are definitely important. But before you consider buying or investing in, or even, just living in any inexpensive or more rural property, right? 'Cause I know a lot of people, especially in this housing economy, right, where housing is definitely more inflated than ever, right? Price of a single family home is, probably the median price is higher than ever, and at the same time, a lot of people aren't able to even qualify for the loans that are available now. It's not as easy going as it was, in last decade or two. So, a lot of people are considering, have like this the tiny home movement. There's, RV parks, that kind of living, RV living, stuff like that. There's also, just camping in general. So, but a lot of times people are thinking to buy a property, maybe they could develop it in the future, they could build a home there, or they could homestead there. So, I'd say a few things that you might want to consider because, a lot of times people don't consider these, especially when talking about inexpensive property. Why is it so inexpensive, right? Maybe it's not just because it's rural, there might be other factors that aren't being considered, right? Obviously the location and accessibility is a big deal because if you live rural, you got to understand, especially if you live with family and you have people with anybody with special needs or anything like that. Are you close to any kind of emergency access? Are you close to stores? Do you have neighbors to help in some way, maybe if an emergency or that special case of need, right? So these are things to consider, like as far as accessibility and getting into or out of a local township is it easy, reasonable to get there if you need to? Is there any emergency access? Is it way down some dirt road where it'd be hard for emergency services to get to if you wanted to call? So there's something obviously to consider when you're living rural, and you may not consider that to be a problem. When you're basically taking on a lot of those things yourself. You're thinking about self defense, emergency medical stuff like that. So you're going to want to be more prepared, right? But another thing too is you're typically in a county, so you're going to want to deal with the county, the city, the county, the council, and so forth, and find out what the zoning and land use restrictions and rights might be there. Are you going to be able to build there? Is there some county or municipal code that would prevent you from doing some things you might want to do in the future there, like farming or homesteading or any part of your homesteading or development, utilities, right, stuff like that. So you definitely want to find out what is the legal access to stuff like utilities. Building out, would that be legally possible? Of course. How expensive would it be if you plan to do that, right? So zoning restrictions are a big deal too because maybe in that area there's a certain type of structure can't be built, right? So that's something to consider too, especially if you're planning on maybe like you want to build a business in a rural area. Some people do that. So always check the zoning laws and see if you're allowed to build a home or a business structure or a farm if that's what you're trying to do. And just find out if there's any restrictions that you might not be aware of or thinking about, right? It's easy to forget about or not think about that. So think about your long-term plans with it, right? Also, the boundaries of the properties, are they clearly set, right? Has the land been fully surveyed, right? Is the measurements definitely accurate? Are they legally bound? Making sure that the boundaries are clearly marked, especially with certain areas that could be indistinguishable ravines and stuff like that, right? So you want to make sure it's encroachments and just areas of the land that aren't so easy to distinguish the boundaries with, right? Maybe there's a crevasse or something like that. So you want to find out, what is the legal survey of the land? Has there been one, or does it need a new surveying? So, and that stuff all can add up in money, right? So just make sure you definitely take into account the finances of something like it. Make it not as cheap as you think it would be, right? Also, like I said, with utilities and infrastructure, Maybe check for, you want to know about the land. Do they have any history of stuff like, sinkholes, lightning strikes? Is it exceptional for certain natural disasters? Flooding, right? Could be a big deal, right? So uh, storms like tornadoes and stuff like that. Is it prone to certain kinds of storms, etc.? So you want to definitely, consider that, right? So, but and find out if there's any way to get the utilities that you might want in the future. Does it have access to water, fresh water, right? What kind of water access is reasonably accessible? Could you build a well? Is there any wells to access? Is there anything that's already on the land that's been built? Any structures to be in, keeping in mind that have already existed on that land in the past, right? So also, the ability to have sewage is, the legal right, stuff like that. Isn't any near any fresh waterways that could be a problem, right? So that's something to consider. Internet access. I'm sure that these days most people can get access to some internet, but at the same time, you want to consider, what kind of speed, stuff like that. How so is it going to take time to get it done? Are you going to be stuck without it for a while? That kind of thing. So, also water in general. Just like what kind of access do you have to water? But is there bodies of water there to consider? What could they be used for? Is there any restrictions about using them? Is there any environmental laws that to consider, right? So that's something to definitely take into account before utilizing the land in the particular way, right? Especially for business purposes or something like that. You could be hit with, some crazy restrictions or fines. Also, in general, what is the soil like? Especially if you're going to farm or something like that. What is the ground quality? What is the terrain quality of that? The majority of that piece of property, right? Is it just an acre, 5 acres, 10 acres, half an acre, whatever it is? That piece of property may need to have those boundaries determined, right? And the quality of the land be assessed or appraised so that you can say, well, is this going to, does this land have any value in the future? Or maybe you want to resell the land at some point. You're going to be able to do that reasonably if you want to, right? That's a question. But yeah, so for farming, gardening, or any kind of soil maintenance, if you're going to do anything like that, it's good to really understand the topography. Is there any buried rock? Is there any sediment? Is there certain kinds of ground to be aware of in terms of the land that might already be established? Like if maybe it was a previous owner of the property, maybe is aware of some stuff that you could ask some questions like that, right? Is it, what do they think about the ability for digging? Or maybe that's something, maybe, you're building an underground, bunker or something. Who knows? I'm just saying, you get the idea. You want to kind of know that stuff ahead of time as much as you can, right? And so that goes into other hazards as well. So, like, like so I talk about sinkholes or flooding areas, especially if you're getting in, maybe some kind of wetlands type of place, right? Contamination, like I was saying, stagnant water, right? And also looking just the general history of all the land around it, right? If you're like near Los Alamos, New Mexico, you might want to know about, where has the nuclear testing been done, stuff like that. I don't know. That's just an example. I'm not claiming to know exactly how that would, go down if you were, maybe in a property like that. I'm just giving you an example of a possibility, right? So, but environmental hazards can be very real. So just consider natural disasters and any kind of, history of the land, the property that you want to consider, right? So land access rights, another thing, right? So is there roads that go into the property? Is there any easements that need to be established? Because if you don't have any legal road, there might not be any legal access for other, mail, emergency services, stuff like that, right? So, is there a legal way to reach your property? That's important. I mean, some property can only be reached by helicopter or maybe boat or something like that. So, in some cases, but like I say, it goes back to really checking with the county and the state that you're in or you're looking in, and also finding out all the the legal fees that can come with it, taxes, and just property taxes in general. It might be higher than you think, so it's good to know that stuff. What's the growth potential for the area? Is it like potentially going to grow and maybe an increase in equity? Is that going to be a good thing? Obviously, equity, you're probably thinking that would be a good thing, but or do you wanting to be around an area that's growing, or you want to be totally isolated and understand that, hey, this land's not necessarily going to be rising in value, probably. But or are you thinking, is this got job growth around somewhere within 30 minutes of here? Is it potential that this is going to grow and increase in value, right? So you want to ask yourself that. But like I said, the big thing though is probably access to general emergency services and utilities in the beginning if you're thinking about building in a rural area, right? So there could be a bit of a cost to that. So especially just in general, getting permits or the development or construction in general. Obviously, you want to account for your total cost of building whatever you're going to be doing there, or however you're going to be doing it, right? But another thing to consider too, as well, is in that area, what is the history in terms of like the wildlife and any kind of pest type of or predatory species, stuff like that. Is there bears common? Is or other beneficial wildlife? Maybe there's a lot of deer access or something like that. Maybe you can use the property for certain things. It could be a good investment that people are overlooking, right? A lot of people might overlook, but yeah. So then, like as far as access to the property too, also thinking about the different times of year. Like, is it going to be snowing heavily in the winter and you're not going to be able to get in or out of the property because the snow is going to be too crazy? Is there any plowing done there? Are you going to need to self-plow? Stuff like that, right? Is there any flooding that happens at certain times of the year to know about, right? So those are just a couple of things, right? And even though you're in a rural area too, it's also kind of pays to learn that even though they're far away from you, probably in many cases in that kind of a situation, but to learn who the neighbors are. Talk to some of the neighbors, right? You can probably learn quite a bit from them just by meeting them. Maybe, let them know who you are. Maybe to have a discussion with some of those neighbors, maybe that are, they might be a ways away from your property, or you might not be real close because it's a rural place, but they can probably still tell you about the history of the area uh, in a number of ways, right? So, maybe find some people online from the area, find out more about it if you haven't visited, and even if you did visit, still a lot of money. You want to see what the locals might say, what more the locals might say, pry a little bit, try to get some information if that makes sense. So, and and then like also like I was talking about going back to resale potential. Are you planning on keeping this property, staying on the property the rest of your life, and that? Honestly, you don't really know that. You might think but you might not really know. You just might feel confident about something, but leave yourself a plan B. Like, how reasonable would it be to sell this property? How much do you have invested in it, or you plan to have invested in it? Is going to be a reasonably high risk for some reason, right? So those are just a few things, like I said, but really making sure that you're really taking into account all the potential hidden costs, because it's easy to think that, just because you're looking at an inexpensive piece of property, overall you're not going to have a lot of potential expenses related to what you might be doing there. Right? Now, if you're just going to plan on camping there and you just want to live, maybe that's your idea or something, but otherwise, if you're planning on building any kind of structure, even just a mobile home or an RV or something like that, you might want to know, is that even legal? If that's what you're trying to do, if you're trying to go you're trying to live on the land or something like that, who knows? But yeah, but another big deal in general too is to keep in mind all the potential legal factors that come into play with the piece of property, and the fact that it could be potentially in some current legal disputes or question in some way or another. So I suggest checking with your county and state and finding out about, like you said, the solidity of the the surveying, any appraisal that might be done on the property, and just finding out if there's going to be any legal problems with it in the future, right? So because those can be a big can of worms, and before you know it, you're spending a long time trying to fix some legal issue. Maybe most of the time it's not, but if there's any kind of dispute, certainly could be something to consider. So these are just a few things I would say. If you're looking into buying property, now's maybe not necessarily the best time to buy it, but if you're doing it wisely, you probably can. I'm not suggesting, hey, you should go live in some rural place or something like that. I'm just talking about tips for those people who are considering that. And there's other things to consider too. I'd say do more research, right? Do more research. But consider your family too. Is it going to be good for anybody that you might be habitating with or your family? Or are they going to definitely, is it going to be too isolated for them or even yourself? It's something to really consider. I know it's easy to think for a lot of people. They think, oh, well, I just, can live with them. A lot of people have that mindset. Then I've done it, like not like as an adult so much, but I've definitely lived out in the middle of like nowhere, that kind of thing, a few times, and even in a town one time of only 35 people. But I've also been even more rural than that, kind of out isolated in the middle of the mountains or something like that for at least a few weeks or longer. And I can tell you, there's definitely benefits to it in terms of, you know, solitude, right? Peace with the, finding, things in nature, exploration, self-exploration and discovery and all those different factors. But, you also, like you said, might find it to be isolating in the long run. Maybe it's something you plan to do for a while. Maybe you want to take your family and have them living in that kind of peaceful environment, or maybe not far from a place where your children can have access to, some reasonable school, stuff like that. But understanding that they may not get the social exposure, you may not get the social exposure that might benefit you in some level. you know. So these are just a few thoughts. And I appreciate you watching the video. Like I say, of course, I always welcome, more like, and then, if you subscribe, if there's anything else here of value for you, certainly welcome it. And at the end of this video, you might even see there's a couple of other videos or a video or two, a suggested video, or you might see something there that you like or want to check out. I certainly encourage listening in or watching. But until next time, I appreciate you listening to this video, and I might have some other ideas that you might want to hear in the future. So I appreciate you coming back to this channel, and until next time, we'll see you in the next video.